beaming from Pacific Junction Hotel to Earth.
Great, Brian, you're connected.
Okay.
Hi, Brian.
Hey.
I know it's just a couple of days after May the 4th and Revenge of the 5th, so happy Star Wars days.
Right, yeah.
All right, are you ready to roll?
Sure, whenever you're ready.
Yo, welcome to my Summer Lair. I'm your host, Sammy Younan. I have today with me Brian J. Jones, whose recent Dr. Seuss biography is called Becoming Dr. Seuss, Theodor Geisel, and the Making of the American Imagination. So congratulations on the book being out. It must be a relief to kind of get that off your desk.
Yeah, it's great always. This is book 4, but it's exciting every time, so.
Rather than ask you the obvious expected question of what's your favorite Dr. Seuss book, which I'm sure you'll be doing a lot of interviews, so that'll get a little bit boring, I'll take a little bit more of a creative route. In the afterward, you mentioned having a daughter, Madison. Is there a particular Dr. Seuss book you enjoyed reading to her, or is there one that she always kind of demanded when she was a little child?
You know, it's funny. She didn't learn to read off Dr. Seuss. She learned to read off of comic books. So we didn't actually have a Dr. Seuss book, and I know that's disappointing to people. So we didn't actually have one that we passed around. You know, she's got The Places You'll Go, things like that. But I was the same way growing up. I learned how to read from also comic books and Peanuts and Family Circus. So I didn't come to Dr. Seuss as somebody who used the book to learn to read. So my favorite ones were always I loved Bartholomew Cubbins, which is sort of an unconventional one because it's written in prose and it's not the easier. It's one of his very first ones. So everybody's relationship with him is a little bit different. And for mine, it didn't come out of been one of those things of sitting down with my kid in my lap reading her a Dr. Seuss book. We came to him differently than that.
So yeah, you mentioned already this is your 4th book. The previous ones are on other pop culture architects, Jim Henson and George Lucas. Why did you follow up those 2 books with Dr. Seuss and not like another pop culture architect like Stan Lee or Walt Disney or somebody else like that?
Oh, you don't think Dr. Seuss is a pop culture architect?
I do think he is a pop culture architect, but why would he be the next one to follow up with rather than say Stan Lee or Walt Disney? I think Dr. Seuss is a major pop culture architect.
Yeah, well, first of all, Disney's been done about as well as you can do it by Neil Gabler. Neil Gabler's Disney book is one of the gold standards. It's one of my very favorite biographies, and really it inspired the kind of biography that I want to write, which I actually got to tell Neil that at one point, and he was very flummoxed and embarrassed by that because he's an awesome guy. But that's a great book. And then Stan Lee is actually being done right now as well. And so those are some of the things we have to actually consider as biographers. We have to know what's coming up and who's got their hands on it. And someone's been writing Stan Lee for quite a while, too, in fact, as well. But for me, it was, that doesn't mean that I'm not going to be like, well, I don't care. I want to, what makes it different is it's going to be my take on it. I mean, that's not enough to scare me away that someone else is doing it. But for me, I love doing these people who are like these big creative icons who are like very hands-on, are doing stuff that nobody's necessarily done before, which, again, Walt Disney's the same way too. What I've been telling people is that with Dr. Seuss, following Jim Henson and George Lucas, is I get to own everyone's childhood now in its entirety at this point.
You're
but
Disney.
But I always love. What I love about these figures is they're all big names who you know. My first book is Washington Irving, who's another really sort of creator of American pop culture. But he's one, if I say Washington Irving, people think I'm talking about a basketball player. Whereas with these guys, I never usually have to explain who they are or what they do. And so that already takes part of the justification or part of the discussion out of the way. I can start concentrating on, let's talk about how they did what they did, because you know who Dr. Seuss is. But now let's talk about who he really was, and let's talk about work like The Cat in the Hat and the Lorax and Green Acres, and let's look at what's behind that work. That to me is the most fascinating part of it, and that's why I try to pick subjects that I can really get into the creative process and how they do what they do and what inspires them and what frustrates them and how long did it take them to do that. So that makes them a sort of a wheelhouse subject for me.
Yeah, and part of getting to know Dr. Seuss, like the subtitle of the book is The Making of an American Imagination. So how does Dr. Seuss's imagination compare to Jim Henson and George Lucas, who also had like this broad vision and created a lot of unique, iconic characters?
Well, the thing they all sort of have in common is they all have their eye on the ball. They all know how they think a project should look, should sound, should feel, should taste, and they're going to do whatever it takes to get to that. And, with Lucas, it was, well, I'm going to make this movie. And if you don't have special effects shop, fine, screw you, I'll build my own. And Jim Henson's the guy who's like, I want to put puppets on TV. They've never been on TV. Fine, let me show you the way a puppet should look on TV. What Dr. Seuss is doing is saying, kids' books kind of suck. And I think kids' books shouldn't suck, and they should be fun to read. Let me show you how that looks. Let me show you what that sounds like. Probably his biggest contribution is he's the one that kicked open the door for kids' books that were, fun to read, that kids wanted to read, and actually had a pedagogy behind them. I mean, a lot of his early books, what sets a book apart, like Cat in the Hat, and a lot of those books moving forward from the earlier part of his career, and this is one of the things I found so fascinating about him, is there's pedagogy behind that. I mean, he's got approved reading lists. There's approved word lists that he has to work with. So a book like Cat in the Hat's got an approved word list of about 300 words, and he ends up using around 225 of them. When you start getting to even more simpler books like Green Eggs and Ham and Fox and Socks, the list is even smaller. And so he's working within the confines of those lists, but doing something really wonderful with them that people hadn't done before. Before that, you had Dick and Jane, who I say in the book, were leading their lives of quiet desperation because it was, look, Dick, look at the ball. The ball is red, 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 red. Trying to work in the repetition and the short words. Dr. Seuss said, those books are terrible. Why would you do that to a kid? Give them a book they want to read. And so that's what he does with Cat in the Hat and Fox and Socks and Green Eggs and Ham. And a lot of those books moving forward, they've got that pedagogy behind them. But, oh, my God, reading was finally fun. And to him, that was probably he considered that his greatest accomplishment, was that he had made reading fun for generations of kids.
And following up on what you're saying about the word list that he used and Dr. Seuss's greatest accomplishment, one of his actual accomplishments was he gave people like you and I the word nerd.
Right.
Can you just share the brief origin of that story? Because that's a great word.
Yeah, it's actually in one of the books that I came to really fall in love with. Before all this, before I got into writing his book, I could have probably named, I could have written down the names of maybe 10 of his books. But If I Ran the Zoo would not have been one of them. And that was one that, as I was doing my research and going through and reading his entire list of books, I really love that book. I think it's one of his best. I think it's one of his most fun. I think it's written in a really lively, fun style that is kind of a peak of his rhyme and rhythm. Because it's before he's hamstrung himself by the word list, so he's kind of letting it all hang out. And the art is just fantastic, and it's fun, and the sense of colors in it. But there's one section in there where it's set up like a lot of his books at the time. It's even sort of set up like Mulberry Street, where it's like, hey, if I ran the zoo, what would I do? What would my animals be? And they start getting more and more and more fantastic as the book goes on. And one of the creatures in his zoo, the narrator says, would be something called a nerd, which just looks like a bird. It's like an angry-looking bird more than anything else. It's not really what we come to think of as nerd, but it's the first time that was ever in print. And very shortly thereafter, Newsweek was already talking about it, and it had already been sort of adapted by, somewhat the term we think of now, but that word then started to evolve and became the word it is today. And then when I was growing up, nerd would still get your head in the toilet. Nowadays, to be nerd is cool. So
yeah, and rich, of course, too.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, that word didn't exist till Dr. Seuss thought of it. And that's one of the things I think is so cool about him is he's got this real knack for coming up with words that didn't exist but sound like they always kind of did. I mean, a word like Grinch is not. It's a very organic sounding word. He loved, even as a young man, in a lot of his work he was doing in his college magazine stuff, he would always come up with these interesting, weird sounding names. And he got really good at it later. Some of his earlier names tend to have an awful lot of consonants and not enough vowels in them. But he loved making up names even very early in his career.
You're touching upon his evolution, and I want to talk about his personal evolution because on page 93, you highlight a fascinating tension about Dr. Seuss. You write, and yet the fact that as a young man, Ted, that's his real name, perpetuated negative racial stereotypes, that cannot be denied. He would evolve, but it would take time. So, and you have a number of examples in the book. Granted, some of this was established norms at the time. So he's talking about like Chinaman, Japanese people, black people, right, using the N-word, obviously. So do the Dr. Seuss books viewed through a different lens if he hadn't evolved and if he hadn't grown and become a better person, I guess, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, and that's a great point. And that was, I knew that was out there when I took this on. And in his lifetime, he even had to deal with this. He's got one interview he does in 1976, and he says, you have to look at these things in perspective of 50 years ago. They may have been funny then, but today I sort of wonder. So, it was an issue he was even thinking about and ruminating even in his lifetime. So I think it's one of the reasons we're all willing to go back and explore those situations along with him. It was something he was aware of.
So the book is entitled Becoming Dr. Seuss, which is what you're kind of following up on, right? What you're talking about now. Would creative people stuck in a dead-end job find inspiration in his unusual career path? Because he didn't have a linear,
he definitely did not.
Once he graduated from Dartmouth, it was all kind of like the Family Circus cartoon where he just kind of like going all over the place, trying to get to a
nice
destination.
Reference.
There
Very
you go.
nice reference. Well done.
Oh, thank you. I have my moments. Yeah, so would you think then creative people as well, then who are stuck in a dead-end job, find inspiration in his unusual career path?
Yeah, I think they would, and I think that's one of the through lines for all the subjects I've done as well. Is they're all sort of a study in stick-to-itiveness.
That's a good reference too.
I wouldn't say Dr. Seuss was necessarily ever stuck in a dead-end job, but he had a very successful career in advertising. But once he started doing kids' books, it was one of the things he really wanted to do for a living. He enjoyed it. He eventually he felt the calling. When he first got into it, it was because there was money on the table, essentially. But I think the more he did it, the more he appreciated it, the more he considered it. There's a moment in the book where he in 1949 he teaches a writing class all about it at University of Utah, and I think that's a big moment. We can talk about that a little bit later. But, that's the moment I think he realizes this is a good profession. He wants to do it for a living. But his books don't sell enough. I know we find that really hard to believe now, but, books like Horton Hatches the Egg were kind of a breakout hit, but didn't earn him enough that he could do it for a living. So he was still doing advertising and still writing kids' books, trying to get the one that was going to land and have the kind of, sales behind it so he could become a full-time writer. That doesn't happen to him until The Cat in the Hat comes along, and he's 53 years old when that book hits. So, it's one of those things where, maybe you find it very inspiring that it took him a long time. He didn't hit it big till he was in his 50s. Now, he was doing financially okay because he was great at advertising, but it wasn't what he wanted to be doing full time. So I hope people will take some inspiration and some solace in the fact that even Dr. Seuss doesn't really become Dr. Seuss until he's in his 50s.
Yeah, that's why the title of the book's Becoming Dr. Seuss, right? Like,
absolutely.
It's like he's steeping like tea, basically. I want to bring it back to you personally. Like, one of the things you do throughout the book is, and I found this very curious, was that you have a lot of quotes from like reviews of his books, and I didn't realize that people at the time were reviewing his books, his children's books, basically. Just seeing how the criticism of his books and how well his work has landed and how it has had a huge impact, has that shaped your perspective on the criticisms that you get for the books that you put out and how your work has evolved over the years?
He never really got a bad review. So it's hard to take the lessons that the rest of us get when we get bad reviews to him, because he never really got a bad review. Probably the better model in my work is Washington Irving, who would get bad reviews and then claim he'd never read them, which is what we all tend to do.
Yes.
Even though we read every word, we're like, oh, I never even saw that one. But for most of his life, he got good, if not great, reviews. Every once in a while there would be a review that didn't quite maybe understand what he was getting at, and his response tended to be like, oh, well, I can understand why they were a little confused by this. And so, I guess as if you want to apply that to my own experience, it might be one of those where, sometimes you're reviewing and you go, well, it was clear they didn't read the book, or they didn't appreciate what I was trying to say there. So even Dr. Seuss at times could be like, okay, yeah, I guess you didn't quite appreciate what I was trying to do something different, and you didn't quite appreciate that. That happened to him with I think The Things You Can Think at one point. He was trying something a little bit new, and people were a little confused by that, and he's like, I was trying something new. I understand why they didn't get it.
And you also referenced that as well for all the places you'll go where people didn't quite get it. Like, there was, I think, one critic who said, like, what's the point of this book?
Yeah, isn't that interesting? One of the criticisms of it was really mean. It was like this whole thing about, like, all the places you'll go is some yuppie manifesto. And like, I was shocked by that.
Mm-hmm.
And the book, and there were other reviewers who loved it, who clearly got it. But Oh, the Place You'll Go doesn't land with the universal adulation that we expect. I mean, it certainly got that, but there were a lot of people who were like, yeah, this is being intentionally pandering. And it really did kind of shock me that it wasn't completely 100% embraced. It was probably 90% embraced, which is pretty good. But yeah, some of the criticism of that book really, really shocked me.
Nerds. Over the last couple of years, I want to tie this into Dr. Seuss, but over the last couple of years, we've been celebrating The Little Prince, which that book turned 75, and that's been a real inspirational kind of children's young adult book. We have two documentaries on that. Again, over the last couple of years, we've been celebrating kind of a Mr. Rogers resurgence. There's been a bio and a doc, and I think Tom Hanks is working on a biopic.
Yeah.
And now you've come out with Dr. Seuss bio. Is this a trend, some sort of like back to nostalgia or childhood, or is this just a coincidence, or how do you view this kind of current era that we're in?
Great question, great point, and I wish I had a good answer for it. It is weird. Sometimes things get in the zeitgeist on this. You know, I mean, and it's like all these projects had to have been in the works long before our current political situation, I guess. So, you know, it is interesting that a lot of us were moving toward these things even several years ago. I mean, I didn't start even working on this book until 16 or 15, I guess, is when we first came up with the idea for it. So, but I do think it, you know, especially something like Mr. Rogers, people are like, look at this, look at the way people treat each other with respect and with kindness, you know. And Dr. Seuss, the work is, I think, what people look at more than him as the person, which is why I'm glad to be able to have a book that talks about him as a person. But, you know, I think the work is one of those things where people are like, look at what people are doing to, you know, educate people and make people happy. I think we are grabbing at anything right now that makes us feel that way in the safety of nostalgia and the safety of childhood. Yeah, I think you're right.
Mm-hmm. And can you comment on, I didn't know how to ask you this, but I thought it was interesting that Dr. Seuss had two prominent women in his life, Helen and Audrey. Could you comment on their contributions to his work? Because again, like we tend to focus on the guy who made the Cat in the Hat.
Yeah.
But those two women, they shaped his legacy. They shaped his work. I don't know how you necessarily sum up them. And that's why I was trying to figure out how to ask you about them, because they tend to get overlooked with the whole Dr. Seuss mythology.
Well, and one of the things I'm so happy about with this book is everybody is asking me that question about Helen in particular. And I think Helen's contribution is so important to his story, because she's the one. First of all, she was one of the first people. He was sitting in class at Oxford doing what he did, which is not studying, and is doodling in his notebook instead of taking notes in his notebook. And she, this other American, he was always trying to find other Americans to cling to when he was over there. He was not really that happy at Oxford, and she's sitting next to him in class. She's 6 years older than he is, and she says, that's a great drawing. Why do you want to become a college professor? This is what you should be doing. I mean, she's the one that really sort of lights that fire in him. It's like, you know, you're good at this. You have talent. This is what you should do for a living. Somebody who can draw the way you do, somebody who's funny like you should do this for a living. And he ends up going back to New York. He marries Helen. And I hope I didn't say Audrey earlier. Anyway, he marries Helen, and he has a very successful career as a cartoonist and as an advertising man. But once he starts doing children's books, Helen is his first editor, his first reader, his best editor, his best reader. He trusts her opinion implicitly. If she says something doesn't work, he might grumble about it, but he knows she's right. He always said she had a great sense of character. She could tell him if characters were not acting consistent, that she had a great sense of plot. She didn't always know how to resolve a plot, but she knew if he had plot problems. And that she was the one. There's a moment in the book when he's working on The Grinch, and he comes out and he's holding these pages out very proudly, and she starts looking through them and says, "No, this isn't right. You've got Papa Who too big, and she says, well, and he says something like, well, they're bugs, and she says, no, they're not bugs, they're people."
Yeah.
And, he probably, I'm sure he got very upset with that. My wife reads my stuff first, and she's always right in her opinion. She reads it, and she knows if I've blown something, and I might grumble, but she's always right. And he's that way with Helen. If she says something, he knows she's right, and he'll go back and he'll do it again until it's right. Her opinion was so important to him that when he finally starts beginner books with Phyllis Cerf, who's the wife of his publisher, not somebody you want to, mess around with too much. But he brings in Helen. So first of all, if it ever came down to needing to vote on anything, he knew he would have Helen in his corner, so he could outvote Phyllis 2-1. But also, he knows that she's great at this. I mean, she was a really good writer of children's books in her own right. She wrote books during World War II that paid some of their bills. There was a Donald Duck book that she did. So, he brings her in because not only does he, again, want to be able to outvote Phyllis, but he knows she's good. He knows that she can make sure books are done the way he thinks they should be done, but how she thinks they should be done too. She was really smart, really savvy, and her role in his work and in his life can't be understated. Let's transition then to Audrey. Audrey, who came after Helen committed suicide, probably because Helen had a lot of health issues late in life, but also the likelihood is that Ted was having an affair with Audrey, and she heard about it, and may have taken her own life because of that. So it's a little up in the air. In the book, I try to talk about this in a thoughtful way. Mm-hmm. I'm hoping people will see what they think. But Audrey is a different kind of collaborator because she doesn't write kids' books. She's interested in doing other things. But Audrey has a really good color sense. She gets him to change that palette a little bit. He goes from some of the really bright colors that he used to use. If you go to a book like The Lorax, you'll see the colors are a little softer and a little more pastel, and that's Audrey's influence. But where Audrey's influence becomes really important actually is after he dies. Because Audrey's the one who's now in charge of the playlist. She's in charge of the Seuss legacy, and she's the one who keeps his name out there. I think his books would have continued to always sold, but Audrey's the one who says, you know what, let's make Dr. Seuss movies, and let's let people do Seussical, the Dr. Seuss musical. We'll license that out so they can do those in high schools, and we can do, a Grinch musical, and we can do Grinch movies with Jim Carrey, and we can do Cat in the Hat movies with Mike Myers, which even she thought was terrible, but she let it be made. She was the one that really kept the name out there, so she deserves a lot of credit there for sort of the business acumen she had after he died to keep that name out there.
So I'll get you out on this. I found it fascinating too reading the biography. I didn't know anything about Dr. Seuss before I read this, so this was all I didn't know anything about Helen. I didn't know anything about what was going on. So it was all like a movie. There's a fantastic Forrest Gump aspect to Dr. Seuss.
Yeah, there really is.
Based on all the different people that he meets, Frank Capra, Jonas Silk. He goes out drinking with Jonas Silk, Chuck Jones, Truman Capote. It's almost like all the places you'll go. I know it was like an end coda of his work, but it was like all the places you go was almost like a reference to his life and his career. And just because he was managed to connect with all these different people or work with them in different ways.
Yeah, that's a really astute, smart point. I don't think that I can improve on that, but that's one of the really fun things about biography, and it's when we're writing that we actually do view everybody almost as a character, as people who write fiction would. And when you get to certain chapters, you're like, oh, great, I get to write Chuck Jones in this chapter. This is going to be fun. Mm-hmm. Or, here's Jonas Salk. They're going to go drink beer together. I get to write that. And so it's really fun as a researcher and as a biographer to actually get your hands on those characters, if you will, if only for a moment. So I'm glad you thought they were fun when they showed up too, because sometimes you'll try to do a reveal that's kind of fun and a little sneaky, and you don't trickle out the name until you've brought the character out on stage, and you're going to have them move around, and then finally you'll tell everybody what the person's name is. Those are all things we try to do to keep things interesting to you. So you're like, oh, that's who that is. But he is fun in that you get LBJ in there at one point, and then he's trying to he's griping about Richard Nixon. So you do see a lot of people are moving in and out of the story quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. Charles Lindbergh, he was another enemy, I guess, just kind of going after him for a little bit too.
Yeah, that whole part of his career to me is so interesting because it's the part that people don't know about, and then when they do know about it, it's we get only a few cartoons. If you look through the 3 years worth of his cartoons, his cartoons from World War II they're fascinating. He had, as you were saying, he had Charles Lindbergh's number early. He didn't like the way Lindbergh talked. He thought Lindbergh was anti-Semitic. He didn't like the America First mentality. He didn't like the American isolationism policy that he was pushing. Like, he really went after Lindbergh. Then once Lindbergh goes down, he turns his fire on Hitler. And a lot of this is even before we've entered the war. He had traveled as a German, a German American. He had actually traveled through Germany several years earlier and had seen Nazi propaganda over there, and really was concerned about the way propaganda impacted, German children and what it was doing to the German people, and really made him nervous. And even Mussolini, he just thought was a complete thug, which kind of shows up in the way he draws Mussolini. But again, really sort of picks the right enemies early on in these things, and you can see this really very progressive point of view. In fact, I see a lot of his cartoons showing up on Twitter and on Facebook today. He's got one about migrant children who are turned away because they're the wrong, they're not white. Or they're not German or whatever. That cartoon is still circulating a lot today. A lot of these cartoons are still very modern in their perspective, even 60, 70, 80 years on.
Which, again, is the legacy of Dr. Seuss. Like, the work, I mean, it started, was it 37, I think, was the first book, until now we continue to celebrate all of his work.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a fine legacy. I mean, it's not, as Huey said, I made reading fun. Who's gonna that's not too bad.
Mm-hmm.
not too bad if that's what you get to go out on. So I think he was proud of what he had done. I think he was pleased when he got the Pulitzer Prize very late in life. I think he felt he wasn't always sufficiently appreciated by the grown-ups. But by that point, you had people who had grown up reading him. It was kind of the first generation who had grown up on him were coming into his own, and I think wanted to be sure he was taken care of with that sort of recognition. So I think I'm glad he got that sort of recognition in his lifetime, because while he would probably have never said so publicly, it was important to him. It's unbelievable if you tell people that he never got the Caldecott Award that they give out. He was a finalist a couple times, but he never got the big one. He ended up getting I can't remember which award he got. He got the
the ALA.
He got the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But he never got the big medal from them, which is, again, people are shocked by that. They would have thought everything that Dr. Seuss published would have been winning medals and awards all the time. But as we've already said, he couldn't even get a bestseller until he was 50 years old.
All right. Thank you so much for hanging out and talking to me about Dr. Seuss. And we did a chronological order, I guess, for most part. We didn't do a very whimsical interview. I have to apologize, I guess.
Well, but that's okay. I always, when people talk about biography and they're like, well, it's chronological. Well, subjects like Dr. Seuss, one thing does kind of lead to another. They are things where you've got to find out how they relate. So I think doing it that way made sense.
So yeah, the book is Becoming Dr. Seuss. It's out now, and the author is Brian J. Jones. Thank you, Brian, for hanging out. And we covered actually quite a bit of his work and his career. So thank you again for the book. Do you have a follow-up subject, or is it still too early and you just got this book out?
It's still too early. I'm still walking Dr. Seuss around right now. So.
All right. We'll look forward to the next one. Thank you, Brian.
All right. Sammy, thanks for making this happen. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm your host, Sammy Younan. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram at My Pal Sammy. Thank you for listening.